Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here. And, man, dude, it's late as fuck right now, and shit like that. I should be in bed right now, and shit like that. But, hey, and shit like that. I need to get these videos done, and shit like that. After this video, I'm gonna do the Zerto Ramirez fight, and I can see about that one fight with that Julian Rodriguez dude and Avius Griffin, and shit like that. But I don't really know, and shit like that. But Jake Paul, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and the Zerto Ramirez versus Julio Dorticus fight, those are the fights that I'm gonna be promoting, and shit like that. And I'm making sure that I get this done tonight, and shit like that. Or not tonight, like it's fucking like 1 something in the morning right now, bro. And shit like that. Almost probably like 2 some. So I mean, so yeah, man, and shit like that, But so if I get tired and shit like that, just know, that's the reason, and shit like that. I don't always do this, but I do always have, but like, I mean, it's, I don't always do it like all the time, to do this, but it's just more of, I just do videos whenever, I get the time to myself to doing it, and shit like that, with nobody around. But basically, Jake, the El Gallo, which I'm guessing that's like this, that's like I don't know what the hell like that stand for. Does it stand for the problem child? I don't even know, shit like that, but Jake El Gallo Paul versus Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., and shit like that, so I mean, like, Jake Paul versus Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., man, like, this is gonna be a test for Jake Paul, and shit like that, and I'm just saying, this is definitely gonna be a test for Jake Paul, and shit like that, and, and the one thing with Jake Paul, man, is just, like I've been saying, like, if like some of you guys, have followed me through, on my other accounts, because I have other YouTube accounts that, I don't use anymore and shit like that, but, I basically said like that Jake, he knows how to box, dude. And shit like that. And from the get go, it's like, when he fought, like let's say Ben Askren, and shit like that, when he fought Ben Askren, that's when I really knew that he can box like that, and shit like that. But overall, Ben Askren isn't like in prayers up to Ben Askren, man, and shit like that. It's like, I know he's going through, he's going through medical issues and shit like that, and he's in a coma right now. Just please, all you guys on this video, please send all your prayers out to Ben Askren, and shit like that, And I know this video is about Jake Paul, but Ben Askren, is Ben Askren, and shit like that, and we can't lose the legend like that, and shit like that, So please give your prayers up to Ben Askren, and shit like that, and yes, and stuff like that, But let me see if this is recording. Gotta admit, okay, and shit like that, But but basically that's the thing and shit like that, and with Jake Paul, and shit like that, he can box, man. Julio Cesar Chavez, this dude has been a bum for once he just started just getting older, he just sucked. Like, it's just like he didn't win a single. I feel like, like right at like once he fought Canelo, and shit like that, or I like let me see on his record, man. But basically, like, just that's the thing though and shit. But I didn't know that Chavez fought Uriah Hall, and shit like that. Probably wasn't paying attention or just didn't really care as much and shit like that, because that's what I'm saying, bro. Like, Chavez, it's like he hasn't done much, just he hasn't done shit, man. It's like it's just, that's the thing, man. It's just like, Chavez should have been done, and Jake Paul literally, like, it like brought him out of out of below, and shit like that, And I'm not trying to be rude or anything, bro, but I'm just speaking facts, bro, and shit like that. I know the truth hurts, but it's the truth, man, and shit like that, and I'm just saying, man, and shit like that, you know, and going against a fighter Jake Paul who still is doesn't have experience like that. He has enough experience to be starting to be in contentions, but it's just more of like Chavez been in boxing for how long, and shit like that, so it's like, but it just Jake's been getting better, man. It's just his boxing's been getting really good, and shit like that, and if he wins this fight, he's gonna be a contender, and shit like that, in the cruiserweight division, and shit like that, because that's what weight class Jake Paul is in the cruiserweight division, but overall I wonder who's gonna be more bigger in this fight between Jake and Chavez, because I mean, I think both of them are going to be, I think, similar in height. If not, I think Jake's probably more taller. But overall, I think, but I know Chavez is not a natural cruiserweight, though, and shit like that, like, but I think he more fought but I think his weight class was like super middleweight and light heavyweight. I think it was, if I'm like, if especially if he's fighting in the cruiserweight division, and shit like that, because it wouldn't be like he would be just a like like only just like 130 something pounds and then fighting in the cruise, like he would be a lot more scrawnier and shit like that, if that was the case, and shit like that, but but that's the thing and shit like that, but yeah, man, and shit like that, Chavez, like, it's just, I just don't know what to say, man. It's just like, I don't even know how I'm even promoting, like, it, like, the only reason why I'm promoting this fight is because of Jake Paul, bro. Like, literally. Like, unless if Chavez was fighting a named fighter, and shit like that, or something, because he has to do some miraculous, or if he kept winning, and if he keeps on winning, and shit like that, then I would start promoting his shit. It just, Chavez, man, he hasn't done anything, dude. It's just, Chavez hasn't done anything, bro, and shit like that, and that's the thing, and it's just, it obviously he hasn't, and shit like that, but it's just like his dad at this age would have been terrorizing boxing, and shit like that, like, it's just like, it's just, I'm not even trying to be rude, but I'm not even gonna try to say that, and shit like that, bro. And I know he be getting tore up by the media, and which is me, and shit like that when it comes down to it. But it's just, this is a big fight for Chavez. And I will say that. This is a big fight for him. Because if he wins this fight, dude, this will bring his career back. I don't care. Beating Jake Paul, and shit like that, will bring your career back, and shit like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, Because Jake, at the same time, is because he could beat boxers, in my opinion. Like, I don't know about, like, high contending boxers. Like, I don't even know about any contending boxers at all, and shit like that, But it's just more of like, he could still beat, like them, blue collar level, like Z level fighters, basically, And I'm saying Z level because that's like the last, like I would say that. I would say maybe like C level, like, I would say maybe like, C level, like, I would just say basically like bums, and shit like that. Basically like, journeymen, who, like, they most likely know they're going to lose a fight, but he could still beat people like that, Jake Paul, and shit like that. But I don't know about anybody that's like a high contender like that, and shit like that, but that's the thing and shit like that, but, yeah, man, and shit like that, but let's just get quickly onto what these fighters' keys are, and shit like that, and actually, I'm gonna just do this right now, but Jake Paul, he's a great boxer, utilizes a good jab, and shit like that. Very good footwork. The one thing with Jake Paul is that he has very good footwork, and especially for his size, and I will say this, and this is naturally for the cruiserweight division, and shit like that. For, like, even like for J.O. Pataya, and shit like that, it's like for a cruiserweight, and shit like that, like, that's the thing and shit like that, it's like, Jake Paul can can move his feet very well, and shit like that. Like Jake can really move his feet, like and shit like bounce to the corners, like get his distance very well. He's very creative with his footwork, and honestly, that's like in his power. But with those two keys, like that's his biggest factor, and shit like that, and overall and shit like that, like Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. also is a type where he likes to move his feet, but he also likes to be more into distance where you're trying to get into his distance. When he's trying to fight you and you're moving around cutting angles and shit like that, which overall like this isn't gonna be no Uriah Hall, and shit like that because Jake Paul, I will say, and shit like that. And as much as I'm not really a big fan of the dude, personality wise and shit like that, I think this dude is a fucking doofus, and shit like that, but it's just at the same time, I gotta be honest and shit like that, it's like, like, he's a lot more slick than Uriah Hall, and shit like that. Way more slick, and he's an actual boxer, excuse me, but and he's an actual boxer, and shit like that. Jake Paul, Uriah Hall. Yes, he's in MMA, and he's been fighting MMA since Jake Paul's probably been in college, and shit like that, or some shit like that, college, high school, still learning, and shit like that, and shit like that academically. And that's the thing, and shit like that, and yeah, and stuff like that, and with Jake Paul, and shit like that, it's like he's still a good fighter, but it's just at the same time, he still has better footwork than Uriah Hall, because when I seen that highlight of Uriah Hall, like, Uriah Hall was just hit, literally so stiff, very fucking stiff, shit like that, has, it's just, he can't, it's just, he doesn't move, no, Jake can actually move from side to side, beautifully, and shit like that, so he can be able to not get hit, or so he can be able to land his punches and shit like that, and be able to, trick you and make it hard for you to kind of be in your own fight, and shit like that, because Jake at the same time ain't that hard to hit, the one thing with Jake till this day, he still struggles with jabs, because with Nate Diaz, when he fought Nate Diaz, Nate Diaz was eating him up with those jabs and then with those hooks. But the one thing with Nate Diaz is that he can. I kind of want to see Nate Diaz back in the ring, but I'm just saying that's the thing with Nate Diaz. He was landing those hooks, and that jab, that jab was he was catching Jake with that jab, and shit like that. But then but the thing is with Jake, is it's just he can fight, dude. I really do feel like that, I wouldn't be shocked if he actually will be a real contender, and shit like that, and that's gonna be crazy, just one came from just being a YouTuber to just being a contending, to just being a real boxer, like a contender, cause he is a real boxer, but I'm just saying beating like good fighters in that division, and shit like that, literally even just stepping foot in the ring against somebody like Zurdo Ramirez, which if he keeps up, which him and Zurdo are I think around the same age, or Zurdo's a little bit older, and shit like that, but if they fought each other, shit, Zurdo would destroy Jake Paul, and shit like that, regardless, but I mean, depending of how good he gets, man, and shit like that, because I mean, it really depends, dude, and shit like that, but hold up, let me end this clip real quick. And Jake Paul, and shit like that, I'm just saying, he could win those contending fights, and shit like that, and I'm just saying, he really can, man, he really could, and I just, it's just, I know I said this a lot, but it's just, he's proved a lot, man. It's just, regardless of what you want to say about, just him being a YouTuber, and shit like that, him fighting MMA fighters, I could see a good boxer when I see one. And Jake is starting to, he's starting to become one, dude, and shit like that, but that's my own opinion. You don't know until reality hits, and shit like that, because, I mean, it's just, it's hard to believe as a boxer fan, as a sports fan, right? Because he's a YouTuber, and shit like that, and then he just magically been like, I just feel like boxing and shit like that, and then now he just, you know, starting to just like he's just the real deal and shit like that, man. And I'm just saying, and shit like that, and I'm just saying, and shit like that, but you know, and that's the thing and shit like that, So it's like, you know, the footwork is gonna be something that's gonna be a big key, and his power is gonna be a big key. He just needs to utilize, you know, his own technique. Just what he's been doing, like all along. He just needs to utilize that. I really just like, in my opinion, I just don't think Chavez is really just anything more different for somebody like Jake Paul, and shit like that, because it's like, because the reason why and shit like that is because it's just, like Jake Paul has been like put like fucking like damn, bro, like literally like it's just like Anderson Silva literally beat Chavez, man. And Jake Paul beat Anderson Silva, and shit like that. And he beat him in good fashion too, and shit like that, And those fights weren't that far apart from each other, and shit like that. And I'm just saying, you know, and then back in the day and shit like that, Anderson Silva, he was a boxer, and shit like that, And also, overall, we know of how good Anderson Silva is with his hands, how good he is with his head movement and everything else, and shit like that, And that's the thing with Anderson Silva, and shit like that, So, and Jake beat Anderson Silva. So it's just like, Jake's been in there with some tough guys, and shit like that, And in my opinion, more tougher, and shit like that than, well, Chavez is one of his toughest fights, I would probably say, but Jake Paul literally had a good fight with Tommy Fury. Chavez would not last against Tommy Fury. And I'm just saying that right now. Like, he would not last against Tommy Fury, and shit like that. He probably would get stopped by Tommy Fury. I wouldn't say stopped because, I mean, Tommy Fury doesn't really have much power like that, and shit like that. I mean, he has enough to drop you and shit like that, and to bug you. And he could stop you still. But it just, overall, it's just like, if you are just naturally a boxer, and shit like that, and you overall are somewhat good and shit like that, which Chavez, like, he still has that talent in him where, he still can be able to, to be able to make things a little tricky. And overall, Chavez has overall enough defense, and enough of a chin, and shit like that for him to not get stopped by Tommy Fury. But I'm just saying, like, he still would have got, it would have not been a close fight with him and Tommy Fury. Jake Paul, like Tommy Fury actually had to really think and know how to win against Jake Paul, and shit like that. So it's just, Jake Paul has been in there and has showcased his talent and shit like that, like more with other fighters and shit like that. That's proved more, in my opinion, and shit like that, to Jake Paul than somebody like Chavez, and shit like that, because I just like, it's just Chavez, I just feel like is a joke, man. Like, I'm really not trying to be like rude or anything like that, man. It's just like, I just think this dude is a joke, because it's just, that's all I gotta say, bro. But what Chavez needs to do to winning this fight, though, Chavez has a lot of what he can do to win this fight, and shit like that, The biggest thing is to not be scared, and shit like that. Pick your shots smartly, like smart, and shit like that, Like, make openings and shit like that, with combinations. And most importantly, he needs to let his fucking hands go. Yeah. I just had to check it. But most importantly, he needs to let his hands go, Julio Cesar Chavez. And shit like that. He can't just keep on just moving around. Like, it's just, like, it's not like you don't know how to fucking fight, Julio. Like, literally, it's just, when you have that much training and shit like that, it's just, at the end of the day, it's like, like, you gotta at least connect punches, you know, and shit. And anybody will know how to connect a punch to a face and shit like that, you know. Everybody might not know it, but everybody can know how to punch somebody in the damn face, you know, and shit like that, you know. Even if it's a weak punch or whatever, you know, and shit like that, you know. And for Chavez, he needs to fucking do that shit, you know, and shit like that in a boxer standpoint, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing and shit like that. Let his hands go, you know, and shit like that, you know. It's like, you know, utilize your experience and shit like that, you know, like utilize the jab, you know, and shit like that, you know. Like, throw your fucking hands, Chavez, you know, and shit like that, you know. But it's just play it safe, you know, at the same time, though, you know, and shit like that, you know, and that's the thing and shit like that, you know. But overall, this is how I see the fight, though, you know, and shit like that. The early rounds, I would probably give the early rounds all to Jake Paul, you know, and shit like that, you know. And what is this? How many rounds is this? Let me actually go and see how many rounds this fight is. A 10 rounder, you know. And so basically I have Jake winning, you know, like let's say how I'm going to have it, you know, and shit like that, you know. So let me actually think this through. So how I have it is that all rounds are going to be in favor of Jake Paul before he stops Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., you know, and shit like that. Because I just feel like Julio, it just, what answer is he going to be able to have for Jake Paul, you know, and shit like that. You know, it's like, no matter what, it's like, you know, you're not going to be able to outbox Jake, you know, and you're not going to be able to win a fight with trying to box Jake, you know, and shit like that. And I'm just saying that right now, you know, and shit like that, you know. But overall it could happen, but I'm just saying, like, I don't see it, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing. I haven't having a little bit of success, but I just see Jake Paul just more just, you know, being the better boxer, you know, landing the more better jabs, you know, even though they're both going to be landing a good amount of jabs, you know, and shit like that, you know, but I see Jake Paul more landing the more jabs, you know, and shit like that, and more just landing the more just punches, and just eventually it's just he's going to start just knowing what he needs to do. And once Chavez is getting a counter and once he doesn't know what to do and shit like that, that's when he folds, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing with Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., you know, and shit like that, you know. So that's the thing, man, you know, and shit like that, you know. So, yeah, man, you know, and shit like that, you know. But basically, you know, I got Jake Paul winning this fight, you know, by I would say between, like, I would say if it's a stoppage, I would say it would have to be like somewhere but in, like, between the later rounds. But if I'm just gonna say, I'm probably gonna say the 6th round that he's gonna get Chavez out of there. But he might not be able to get him out of there and shit like that, because I mean Chavez is a tough, gritty fighter who he doesn't go down, you know, very easily, unless if just he has no other choice, you know, or in your shots don't feel very well. And overall, Jake's shots don't feel very well. So I mean, that's what I'm saying. Just if Jake is just consistently just landing his punches, it's just, that's what I'm just saying, man, and shit like that. What can Chavez do? You know, and shit like that, you know, nothing. You know, and shit like that, you know. So yeah, man, you know, and shit like that, you know. I got Jake Paul winning this fight by a stoppage. Thank y'all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Peace out, man.